Up to 40 minutes.
Without objection, so ordered.
And if it's agreeable to Senator Levin, I say to my friend from South Carolina, if we could each make a brief opening statement, or maybe 6-7 minute opening statement, and then maybe have a colloquy amongst us. Would that be agreeable to the Senator from Michigan?
Mr. President.
Senator from Michigan.
Yeah, it is agreeable with me. My statement would probably be about 7 or 8 minutes. And I think, I don't know how long Senator Menendez, was he the fourth senator, I think, who was going to participate, how long his statement was planned on being. But I think, was it 40 minutes that the senator from Arizona sought? I think that ought to be enough.
I thank my colleagues, and I want to thank my dear friend from South Carolina, whose efforts on another issue, that of Benghazi, has brought the attention of the American people to a tragic situation that happened there, and we need to place responsibility for it. And if it had not been for his tenacity and effort on this issue, I do not believe it would have been brought to the attention of the American people yesterday. So I'd like to thank him for his usual and unusual continuation of efforts on behalf of the families of those who were killed. But today, Mr. President, I and my colleagues are here concerning Syria. The strategic and humanitarian costs of this conflict continue to be devastating, not just for the people of Syria, but for vital American interest. As today's Washington Post editorial makes clear, nearly all of the terrible consequences that those opposed to intervention predicted would happen if we intervened in Syria have happened because we have not. There's mounting evidence that chemical weapons have been used by the Assad regime, as many of our colleagues have noted, including Senator Feinstein, the chairman of the Intelligence Committee. President Obama's red line on Syria has been crossed, but instead of acting, the Obama administration has called for additional evidence to be collected by UN investigators who have not yet set foot in Syria and probably never will. In the absence of more robust action, I fear it will not be long before Assad takes this delay as an invitation to use chemical weapons again on an even larger scale. Moreover, as I've said before, by drawing a red line on chemical weapons, the President actually gave the Assad regime a green light to use every other weapon in his arsenal with impunity. More than 70,000 Syrians have been killed indiscriminately with snipers, artillery, helicopter gunships, fighter jets, and even ballistic missiles. Indeed, according to a recent Human Rights Watch report, more than 4,300 civilians have been killed by Assad's airstrikes alone since July 2012. At the same time, Iran and its proxy Hezbollah are building a network of militias inside Syria, and the al-Qaeda-aligned al-Nusra Front has gained unprecedented strength on the ground. According to estimates that have been published in the media, some believe there were no more than a few hundred al-Nusra fighters in Syria last year, but today it is widely believed there could be thousands of extremist fighters inside of Syria. They are gaining strength by the day because they are the best, most experienced fighters. They are well-funded and are providing humanitarian assistance in the parts of Syria where people need it most. At the same time, this conflict is having increasingly devastating consequences to the security and stability of our allies and partners in Israel, Jordan, Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees has characterized the situation in Syria as an existential threat for Lebanon, where the government estimates that 1 million Syrians have entered the country. 1 million Syrians have entered the country of Lebanon, which has a population of just over 4 million. Similarly, over the past 2 years, more than 500,000 Syrians have flooded into Jordan, a country of just 6 million people. Consider for a moment that in proportional terms this would be equivalent to 26 million refugees, or the entire population of Texas suddenly crossing our own borders. In short, Syria is becoming a failed state in the heart of the Middle East, overrun by thousands of al-Qaeda-affiliated fighters with possibly tons of chemical weapons and poised to ignite a wider sectarian conflict that could profoundly destabilize the region. Yesterday brought news that the administration plans to organize, together with Russia, an international peace conference later this month to seek a negotiated settlement to the war in Syria. All of us are in favor of such a political resolution to this conflict. No one wants to see this conflict turn into a fight to the death and total victory for one side or the other. We all want to work towards a political settlement that forms a new governing structure in Syria reflective of the democratic aspirations of the Syrian people. But let's be realistic. One of the lessons of the past 2 years is that such a negotiated settlement will not be possible in Syria until the balance of power shifts more decisively against Assad and those around him. Until Assad, as well as his Iranian, Hezbollah, and Russian backers no longer believe they are winning, what incentive do they have to come to the table and make a deal? This is what two well-meaning United Nations senior envoys have already learned. Yes, Syrian opposition forces are gaining strength and territory on the ground, but Assad still has air power, a decisive factor in that climate and that terrain. Ballistic missiles, chemical weapons, and a host of other advanced weaponry, and he is using all of it. Furthermore, today's news reports that Russia has agreed to sell Russia has agreed to sell an advanced air defense system to the Assad regime should lead us once again to ask us whether the path to peace in Syria really runs through Moscow. I know Americans are war-weary and eager to focus on our domestic and economic problems and not foreign affairs. I also know the situation in Syria is complex, and there are no ideal options. But the basic choice we face is not complicated. Do the costs of inaction outweigh the costs of actions? I believe they do. No one should think that the United States has to act alone, put boots on the ground, or destroy every Syrian air defense system to make a difference for the better in Syria. We have more limited options at our disposal, including limited military options that can make a positive impact on this crisis. We could, for example, organize an overt and large-scale operation to train and arm well-vetted Syrian opposition forces, a course of action that was recommended last year by President Obama's entire national security team. I'm encouraged that Senator Menendez, chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, has introduced legislation this week on this very issue, and that he is speaking out about the need for more robust action in Syria, including in addressing Assad's air power. As several key leaders in our own military have pointed out in testimony to the Senate Armed Services Committee over the past several months, from General James Mattis to Admiral James Stavridis, we have the capacity to significantly weaken both the Assad regime's air power and its increasing use of ballistic missiles, which pose significant risks as delivery vehicles for chemical weapons. To address this threat, we should use our precision strike capabilities to target Assad's aircraft and Scud missile launchers on the ground without our pilots having to fly into the teeth of Syria's air defenses. Similar weapons could be used to selectively destroy artillery pieces and make Assad's forces think twice about remaining at their posts. We could use the Patriot missile batteries outside of Syria to help protect safe zones inside of Syria from Assad's aerial bombing and missile attacks. Would any of these options immediately end the conflict? Probably not. But they could save innocent lives in Syria. They could give the moderate opposition a better chance to succeed in marginalizing radical actors and eventually provide security and responsible governance in Syria after Assad falls. However, the longer we wait, the worse the situation gets, and the tougher it will be to confront, as we will inevitably be forced to do sooner or later. I'm encouraged that a consensus is emerging, and many of our colleagues, Democrats and Republicans alike, share this view. I note, Mr. President, the leadership of Senator Levin, the chairman of our Armed Services Committee, who I joined in writing a letter to President Obama urging him to take more active steps in Syria. I also note the important voice Senator Bob Casey has lent to this debate, and that his op-ed printed last week in Huffington Post, Time to Act in Syria, which calls for consideration of more options, including cruise missile strikes to neutralize the Syrian Air Force, be included in the record. Mr. President, let me conclude with one final thought for America. Our interests are our values, and our values are our interests. The moral dimension cannot be lost from our foreign policy. If ever a case should remind us of this, it is Syria. Leon Wieselter captured this point powerfully in the New Republic this week, and I quote, 70,000 people have died in the Syrian war, most of them at the hands of their ruler. Since this number has appeared in the papers for many months, the actual number must be much higher. The slaughter is unceasing, but the debate about American intervention is increasingly conducted in realist terms. The threat to American interests posed by jihadism in Syria, the intrigues of Iran and Hezbollah, the rattling of Israel, the ruination of Jordan and Lebanon and Iraq. They're all good reasons for the President of the United States to act like the President of the United States. But wouldn't the prevention of ethnic cleansing and genocidal war be reason enough? Is the death of scores and even hundreds of thousands and the displacement of millions less significant for American policy and less quickening? The moral dimensions must be restored to our deliberations. The moral sting, or else Obama, for all his talk about conscience, will have presided over a terrible mutilation of American discourse, the severance of conscience from action. Nearly 2 decades ago, I worked with Democratic and Republican colleagues in Congress to support President Clinton as he led America to do the right thing in stopping mass atrocities in Bosnia. The question for another president today and for all Americans is whether we'll again answer the desperate pleas for rescue that are made uniquely to us as the United States of America. Thank you, Mr. President. I ask my friend, I first would ask both of my colleagues one question, and then it would be all right. There's news today that the Secretary of State is wants to convene a conference, including the Russians, in order to try to bring about a resolution. At the same time, we read reports that the Russians are selling Syria the most advanced weapons. I guess I would ask my colleague from South Carolina and then Senator Levin, because I know he has a statement.
Well, that would be a big contradiction, and I would just yield to Senator Levin to answer the question and make his opening statement.
I think first of all, the Senator from Arizona for a leadership that he has taken in the question of Syria, and the answer to the question, to the best of my ability at least, is it wouldn't be the first time that Russia has taken an inconsistent position. What I am hoping is that the additional military pressure on Assad, which we are all calling for this morning, would help put pressure on Russia to understand, if that military pressure is forthcoming, that they should participate in the political solution. I don't know that we can stop them as much as we would all wish to taking the inconsistent position that they have, but I believe, and I think the senator from Arizona would probably agree, but he could speak for himself obviously, that if President Obama does as we are urging him to do, which is find a way to put additional military pressure on Assad, that would be an important sign to Russia that, okay, join in a solution. You participated enough in the problem already. Join in the solution. So I think it's very inconsistent, but I think our goal of trying to get more military pressure on Assad is very consistent with the idea that maybe there will be a political solution, but if there is, it will be promoted by military pressure on Assad and his understanding of that fact. Mr. President, the worsening situation in Syria and the snowballing plight of millions in the region requires a response. Since nonviolent demonstrations demanding democratic change began in Syria in March of 2011, Bashar Assad and his clique of supporters have unleashed a massacre that has claimed the lives of at least 70,000 Syrians, displaced more than 4 million people across a region that already suffers from a massive refugee population, sparked a civil war with a multitude of divergent ethnic groups and religious sects, and placed the security of Syria's chemical weapons stockpile, which is one of the world's largest, at risk of falling into the hands of terrorist groups. Despite the impact of this horrific campaign, Assad's commitment to continuing the fight appears unwavering. One must look no further than the increasingly indiscriminate tactics with which he conducts his campaign. In recent months, in addition to Assad's possible use of chemical weapons, he has increased his reliance on airstrikes, Scud missiles, rockets, mortar shells, and artillery to terrorize and to kill civilians. Assad's ability to conduct this campaign is enabled by two actors, Iran and Russia. Iran's financial, personnel, and material support have been critical to ensuring Assad's military remains operable and that the impact of defections is mitigated with reinforcements. Russia's support to Syria's more advanced military weaponry, most notably air defense systems, is critical to Assad's continued ability to project power into areas of the country that he no longer controls. To add further complexity to the situation, al-Nusra Front, a al-Qaeda offshoot, continues to spread its influence in some areas of Syria. Its presence is of concern, and countering its spread needs to be a priority. It is also critical that we ensure that countries in the region that are seeking to force an end to the Assad regime are not enabling and enhancing the capabilities of violent extremists that will ultimately turn their weapons on moderate Syrians and on religious minorities in Syria, such as the Syrian Christians. The combination of these circumstances in Syria demonstrates that the status quo is unacceptable and that time is not on our side. Many officials in Washington share this sentiment, but in the same breath remind us that the situation in Syria is complex, volatile, and asymmetric. Syria's government institutions are crumbling, which could create a dangerous vacuum. Any action by the United States or the West, even if it's with our Arab partners, risks significant escalation, and that any security vacuum could be filled by Islamist extremists. Well, Mr. President, I have supported and I will continue to support the President's contributions to provide humanitarian relief to the Syrian people throughout the region, as well as the additional assistance he has pledged to Jordan to help with the devastating impact of this conflict on that country. But it is essential, Mr. President, that the United States, working with our allies in the region, step up the military pressure on the Assad regime, of course doing so in a carefully thought out and regionally supported way. Certainly there are significant challenges to any plan of action in Syria, but we not only have to figure out the consequences of any action, we also have to figure out the consequences of not taking additional actions. In my view, the facts on the ground today make the consequences of inaction too great, and it is time for the United States and our allies to use ways to alter the course of events in Syria by increasing the military pressure on Assad until he concedes that his current course is not sustainable. Taking steps to add military pressure on Assad will also provide backing to Secretary Kerry's efforts to bring the Russians into the dialogue politically, which is aimed at leading to Assad's departure. And I commend Secretary Kerry for his efforts to bring Russia into that dialogue. At the same time, of course, we condemn Russia's support for the Assad regime. And I happen to feel very strongly that even though we are condemning and should condemn Russia's support for the Assad regime, it is still in our interest that Russia participate in putting pressure on Assad politically to depart if Secretary Kerry can possibly do so. I have joined Senator McCain recently in writing to President Obama, urging the President to consider supporting a number of efforts, including the creation by Turkey of a safe zone inside of Syria along its border, the deployment of our Patriot batteries closer to that border in order to protect populations in that safe zone, and to neutralize any Syrian planes that threaten it, and also to provide weapons to vetted elements of the opposition in Syria. These actions, raising the military pressure on Assad, will send the critical message to Assad that he is going to go one way or the other. The Armed Services Committee, which I chair, recently held an open hearing on the situation in Syria and the Defense Department's efforts to plan for a full range of possible options to respond to the contingencies in Syria. Our committee is set to receive a classified briefing on Syria next week, and I intend to raise these issues with our witnesses at that briefing, and I know that Senator McCain and Senator Graham and others are also going to forcefully raise these issues with those witnesses at that briefing, and to urge them to carry the message back to the administration that it is time to up the military pressure on Assad. I thank the Chair. I thank Senator McCain and others who are participating in this discussion, and I also would ask unanimous consent, Mr. President. I have 5 unanimous consent requests for committees to meet today. During today's session of the Senate, they have the approval of the majority and minority leaders, and I would ask consent that the request be agreed to and that they be printed in the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
And I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
Senator from New Jersey.
Mr. President, I want to join with my distinguished colleagues here in our collective call for a greater engagement. And I start off, as I always do in my years in Congress between the House and the Senate, with 2 questions. What is in the national interest of the United States? What is in the national security interests of the United States? And from the answers to those 2 questions is, in essence, how I determine my views, my advocacy, my votes, and the policies I want to pursue. And there are vital U.S. interests engaged in Syria. First, of course, there is a humanitarian crisis, probably the most significant humanitarian crisis at this moment. 70,000 dead and climbing, 4 million displaced, and that is, of course, an urgent call. But beyond that, we have large chemical weapons stockpiles that potentially can fall into the wrong hands. And some have, by a whole host of public reports, already been used against the Syrian people. And unless you believe that somehow the rebels have in their possession chemical weapons, then this largely has to be from Assad. And he has used them, and I think once you use them, you are willing to use them even in greater quantities. And that is a real concern. The Syrian state could collapse. That would leave a safe haven for terrorists constituting a new threat to the region. You already have al-Qaeda-affiliated al-Nusra. You have Hezbollah. You have the Iranian Guard. You have the opportunity for a safe haven for terrorists constituting a new threat to the region with broader implications for our own security. The refugee crisis and sectarian violence spread instability throughout the region. The King of Jordan was here about 2 weeks ago and sat with our committee, and he made it very clear. His population has already increased by 20%. At the rate it's going, the population of Jordan could double. That is not sustainable for the kingdom. This is one of the countries that has been one of our most significant and faithful allies and a constructive ally in the region. We cannot afford for that ally to ultimately find itself in a position in which it could very well collapse. So we look at all of that, and finally, there could be no more strategic setback to Iran, which is this body has spoken collectively and in a bipartisan, united fashion to stop its march towards nuclear weapons, than to have the Assad regime collapse. That would be a tremendous setback to Iran and would cause a disruption in the terror pipeline between Iran and Hezbollah in Lebanon. So these are just some of the vital national security interests of the United States in changing the tide. Now, under the present set of circumstances, Assad believes that he is winning. And for so long as he believes as he is winning, he will continue the course that he is on. There has to be a change in the tipping point here. And after 2 years, I believe that there are those in the opposition, rebels that we can and have thoroughly vetted, that we can assist in trying to change that tipping point. If you have a monopoly on air power and an artillery, then the reality is you won't see a change on the ground. And so the legislation that I have introduced and am working with colleagues on begins to move us in a different direction. It is to seek to arm thoroughly vetted elements of the Syrian opposition so that we can change the tipping point. It is to, of course, continue to provide humanitarian assistance and at the same time work for the assistance of a transition fund to help those rebels that are already controlling parts of the civilian population, to help them administrate there and prepare for the future. But the key point here is that unless we change the dynamics on the ground, we will not have a change in the regime. And for so long as the regime can continue to bomb indiscriminately its citizens, and if the reports, as we have seen it from various countries, including our own, suggest that Assad has used chemical weapons against his own citizens, that is only an invitation to allow him to continue to do it unless we act. And so I am willing to consider other options. I know that my colleague, Senator McCain, very distinguished in this field, has suggested others. I am willing to consider those as well. But I think that finally we strengthen the hand of the administration and Secretary Kerry. We all want to see a politically, diplomatically achieved solution. But in the absence of changing the calculus not only of Assad but of his supporters, that have propped him up to believe that he will fall. Unless they believe he will fall, I'm not sure that we've changed the calculus for the political opportunity to take place and the diplomacy to be effective. I think that these efforts strengthen the hands of the administration, creates a parallel track that if diplomacy fails, we will have an opportunity to pursue our vital national interests and security interests, end the humanitarian tragedy, and create the type of stability we want to see in the region. So I appreciate my colleague bringing us together on the floor and look forward to continuing to work with him as well. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
I thank the distinguished chairman, and may I say it's been a great pleasure for me to have the opportunity to serve on the Foreign Relations Committee, of which Senator Menendez is the chairman. His stewardship of that committee, I think, has been outstanding, and I appreciate the very articulate argument that the chairman just presented, including the strategic dimension of this whole issue, which sometimes particularly when you focus so much on the humanitarian side, that the strategic interest of the fall of Bashar Assad is something which I think adds another dimension, and I thank the Senator and Chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee.
Mr. President.
Senator from South Carolina.
I would just like to echo what Senator McCain said about Senator Menendez, and I would like to, for the record, to note that the tide of war in Syria changed today because of what's happening on the floor in the United States Senate. And that may be hard for people to understand, but I really don't think so. How do you change the tide of battle? You make it certain to the world that Assad will go, and you provide hope to those who are fighting him that you will prevail. And I would suggest that a bipartisan consensus is forming in the United States Senate that now is time to do more, not less, when it comes to Syria, including arming the rebels, the right opposition with the right weapons, which will eventually change the tide of battle. So to those who have been following this debate about Syria, To those who've been in the fight trying to topple this regime, I cannot stress to you how important today is in your cause. Because when you get Senator Levin and Senator Menendez, two institutional important figures because of their chairmanship, but beyond that, important because of who they are and what they bring to every debate around national security, combined with Senator McCain and others, you have turned the tide in Washington. As to Senator McCain, you have been talking in the most eloquent terms for at least a couple of years about stopping this war in Syria, ending the Assad regime and replacing it with something better. You have been right, as you usually are, but now is not the time to look backward, it's to look forward. I think an effort by the Senate and the House to acknowledge that the tide of war needs to change and we should be bolder in our support for the opposition is going to increase the likelihood of a peaceful solution through diplomacy. The Russians have to know after today, if you know anything about American politics, the game has changed when it comes to Assad, and this is a monumental sea change in terms of the war in Syria by having 4 United States senators who care about such matters, foreign policy, to speak out and say we will support arming the rebels and being more involved militarily. To the opposition, this is a great day for you. To Assad, this seals your fate. Now, what do we do and how do we do it? It won't all end tomorrow because of this colloquy today, but we're well on the way to ending this war. And here's the choice. The current regime, which is evil to the core, and an imperfect opposition, which has been infected by radical Islam. You can fix the second one, you can't fix the first. It's that simple to me. The sooner the war ends, the better, not only for saving people in Syria from further slaughter, but preventing what I think would be an erosion of our national security interest in 4 areas. If this war goes 6 more months, a failed state will emerge in Syria. It will be so fractured you can't put it back together again, and the 6,000 al-Qaeda-associated fighters will grow in number, and there will be a safe haven in Syria like there was in Afghanistan. That's not good for us. Unlike Afghanistan, there's enough chemical weapons in Syria to kill thousands, if not millions, of Americans and people who are our allies. I worry greatly not only that chemical weapons have been used in Syria on the opposition by the regime, but those same chemical weapons will be used in the future by radical Islamists against us. The next bomb that goes off in America may have more than nails and glass in it. And the only reason millions of Americans or thousands of Americans haven't been killed, hundreds of thousands, by radical Islamists, they just can't get the weapons to kill that many of us. They would if they could. And I've never seen a better opportunity for radical Islamists to get a hold of weapons of mass destruction than I see in Syria today. And every day that goes by, their opportunity to acquire some of these weapons grows dramatically. And if you ask me what I worry the most about Syria and why we should get involved, is for that very reason. If these weapons get compromised, they're going to fall into the hands of the people who will use them against us, and to believe otherwise would be incredibly naive. Jordan, probably the most stabilizing figure in the Mideast in these dangerous times, is the King of Jordan. His country is being overrun by refugees. If this war goes on 6 more months, that's probably the end of his kingdom, because it will create economic chaos and political instability, and he will be a victim of the civil war in Syria, which will have monumental consequences for our own national security. As we talk about Syria and chemical weapons falling into radical Islamist hands, we're dealing with a radical regime in Iran who is marching toward building a nuclear weapon. If you think the Ayatollahs in Iran are trying to build a nuclear power plant at the bottom of the mountain, you're wrong. They're trying to build a nuclear weapon to ensure their survivability. And God only knows what they would do with nuclear technology, but if you believe what they say, they would wipe Israel off the map and we would be next. So I tend to believe what they say. If you allow Syria to continue to deteriorate and have a hands-off policy toward Assad, then I think you're sending the worst possible signal to Iran, because as Senator Levin said, The really only ally that Iran has today is Assad in Syria. And how can we convince the Iranians we're really serious about your nuclear program? We don't seem to be very serious about Assad using chemical weapons against his own people. What a terrible signal to send at one of the most important times. I would just end with this thought, that this bipartisan consensus that is emerging today is going to pay great dividends. It's going to be helpful to the President. We can end this war sooner rather than later. But no matter what happens, there's going to be a second war in Syria, unfortunately. That second war is going to be between radical Islamists who want to turn Syria into some kind of al-Qaeda-inspired state and the overwhelming majority of Syrians who want to live a better life and be our friends, not our enemies. This war will occur after the fall of Assad, but it will end the right way. The sooner we get the first war over, the shorter the second war will be. And I think we can bring this war to a close without boots on the ground. The sooner we act, the better. And one last thought. As to the opposition, you would be helping your cause if you would let the world know that you don't want Assad's chemical weapons, that the new Syria will not be a state that wants weapons of mass destruction, that you would agree that these weapons should be controlled by the international community and destroyed, that you would agree to an international force coming on the ground with your blessing the day after Assad falls to secure these weapons and destroy them for all time. I think you'd be helping your cause. So to Senator McCain, I really appreciate your leadership for a couple of years, but persistence does matter in politics and all things that are important. And I think your persistence is paying off. To Senator Menendez and to Senator Levin. What you've done today, joining up in a bipartisan fashion, is going to pay great dividends for our own national security interest. The way forward is pretty clear to President Obama. We want to be your ally. We want to be your supporter. We want you to get more involved, not less. We realize it's hard. We realize there are risks no matter what we do. But as Senator McCain said before, the risk of doing nothing or continuing on the track we're on is far greater than getting involved and ending the war sooner.
I just asked one question, my colleague. I understand recently you made a trip to the Middle East, and you know, there's nothing like seeing the terrible consequences of war, and I understand you visited a refugee camp. Maybe for the benefit of our colleagues, you could take a minute to describe the horrible conditions and things that people, I believe now over 1 million refugees have been subjected to, and their failure to understand why we won't be of more assistance to them.
Well, I thank the Senator for the question. It was one of the most compelling trips I've ever made to the Mideast. We went to Turkey, and we went to Jordan, and we went to a refugee camp in Jordan. 40-something thousand Syrian children are now in Jordanian schools. I mean, the burden on Jordan is immense, but when you talk to the people in the camps about what they've gone through and their loved ones have gone through, it's heartbreaking. But just from a national security point of view, once you visit the camps, you understand what's at stake here. They tell you about radical Islamists moving in, and they don't want no part of them, but at the end of the day, they're having more influence because we're not in the fight. And you can do this without boots on the ground. And the most chilling thing they tell us, Senator McCain, you've been echoing for a long time, they're telling us that their children are watching the United States. And like it or not, we have a reputation in the world that we can do almost anything. Well, we can't do almost anything, but we are seen as a force for good. And the people in Syria are just beside themselves, wondering, where is America? America to them is an idea. They want to be like us because it means freedom, economic opportunity. It means having a say about your children's future. And they are just dumbfounded that we're not more involved given the stakes that exist in Syria. And they tell us without any hesitation that the young people of Syria will remember this moment. They will hold this against us. And I think I know what they're telling us. And here's the good news. There's still time to act. It doesn't have to end that way. The conditions in Syria are horrible. The refugee camps are beyond imagination. The UN's doing a great job. They're running out of money. Jordan's about to fall if we don't stop this war. from a human point of view, Senator McCain, we've got to get this war over, and America needs to be seen as being part of the solution, not part of the problem. From a national security point of view, Syria is going to become a nightmare for the whole world, including the United States.
Thank my colleagues. Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to include in the record a piece by Senator Casey called "Time to Act in Syria." It was in the Huffington Post, Washington Post editorial entitled "Repercussions of Inaction," Wall Street Journal article, "U.S. has warned Russia plans Syria arms sale," and finally a piece by Leon Wieselter that is in the New Republic.
Without objection.
I thank my colleagues. I yield.
Morning business is closed. Under the previous order, the Senate will resume consideration of S-601, which the clerk will report.
Calendar number 44, S-601, the bill to provide for the conservation and development of water and related resources and so forth, and for other purposes.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
Mr. President, for the interest of all senators, I want to thank everyone for cooperating with us. We have handled a number of amendments, one quite controversial and non-germane, but we dealt with it. It's not on this bill, I'm happy to say. We're trying to keep this bill a water infrastructure bill. There may be a few exceptions, but for the most part, that's what we want because it will increase the chances of passage all the way through to get it to the President's desk. The bill we're dealing with, the Water Resources Development Act, was last authorized in, I believe it was 2007. It is high time we did a follow-on bill. And what we're talking about here is flood protection, projects we need all over the country to protect our people from the ravages of floods. We need to make sure that our ports are operational. I know my friend in the chair certainly deals with all these matters in his great and beautiful state of Hawaii. We need to make sure our ports are deep enough, that they have enough funding to stay modernized, and they can move that cargo in and out with ease. We have environmental restoration. We have to take care of all of our water infrastructure. I know Senator Merkley is here to say something about the bill, which I'm very pleased about, and so I'm going to be very brief, but I'm going to talk for about 2 more minutes and just say that we have a really great committee, the Environment and Public Works Committee, when it comes to infrastructure. We see eye to eye, we work together. Yeah, we have our differences, but we can bridge those differences. And this bill is a product of working together. It's a product of collaboration, not only in the committee where we work together, but even here when it got to the Senate, we've worked, Senator Vitter and I, with individual members to meet all of their needs. There are no earmarks in this bill. So whatever we do is really setting policy. And it's an exciting bill. It includes reforms that I think are important. And most of all, I think the people at home are going to like it because it gives them a lot of, it puts them in the driver's seat and protects them from delays and other problems as they move forward with projects that their people need. So we have some terrific supporters of this legislation, and I'll close these early remarks. AFL-CIO, and we have the Chamber of Commerce, we have the American Society of Civil Engineers, we have Association of Equipment Manufacturers, we have many, I'll show you the next chart, a couple of, we have the Transportation Construction Coalition, the United Brotherhood of Carpenters, storm management agencies, surveyors, engineers. So I think what you see here is really mainstream America is behind this bill. The bad news is our infrastructure has been rated at a D+. You can't be the greatest nation in the world and have an infrastructure that's rated D+. So while we have major problems in other fronts on our committee, and I have to admit today was not a good day for me or the committee or the American people, when the Republicans boycotted the markup of Gina McCarthy to be the head of the Environmental Protection Agency. After she answered more than 1,000 questions, she is the most qualified, I think, ever to be nominated, having served How about this? 4 Republican governors. What more do they want? And the fact is that 70% of the American people want clean air, want clean water, want safe drinking water. Gina McCarthy deserves a vote, not a boycott. They say they don't like her answers. Well, I'm not surprised. She's not Mitt Romney's nominee for the EPA. She's not Rick Perry's nominee for the EPA. She's Barack Obama's nominee for the EPA, and it is her position, as it is the President's, that we should enforce the Clean Air Act, the Safe Drinking Water Act, and so on. You know, when Republican presidents put up nominees for the EPA that I didn't agree with, I didn't filibuster them. I said, okay, I'll vote no. Let them go. So it's really a sad day for me on the environment side of my committee. On the public works side of my committee, it's a good day because we're making progress. We have now about a half dozen amendments that have been cleared on both sides. We're waiting to try and make them pending or clear them. And we're asking all senators, please get your amendments in because this can't go on forever. We need to pass this bill. 550,000 jobs are supported by this legislation. And hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of businesses are looking forward to our doing this. That's why we have this amazing array of support. So with that, I would say to Senator Merkley, the floor is yours, and I would yield the floor at this time.
Mr. President.
Senator from Oregon.
Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to talk about one particular aspect of this bill, which is WIFIA. But before I explain what WIFIA is, I want to thank the Chair for managing this bill in a very bipartisan discussion in committee, that it's come to the floor with full committee examination, thorough debate, amendment process, and here we are having a very thorough, visible, accountable process for considering this bill on the floor of the Senate. And that's just a very good example of the Senate working well. And thank you, Madam Chair. The heart of the WIFIA program is about jobs. It's about infrastructure. 5 years after the greatest economic crisis in 80 years, we still face a serious jobs crisis. Too many are out of work and too many are unemployed. A good living wage job is the most important pillar of the American dream. There is no public program that can compare to the importance of a living wage job for the stability and success of a family. And so we have to do more to create those jobs, a lot more. Now, wouldn't it be great if we could both create jobs and fill a desperate national need at the same time? Well, that is exactly what WIFIA, which is short for Water Infrastructure Financing Innovation Act, that is exactly what WIFIA does. Low-cost loans for water infrastructure projects create good jobs now, while protecting our communities from devastating costs or public health crises in the future. And WIFIA does all this while making taxpayers money over time. The need for water infrastructure is great. Across Oregon and across America, our infrastructure is aging. That aging infrastructure needs to be replaced. Our communities are growing. The demand for water infrastructure increases, whether it's water treatment on the front end or water treatment on the back end, sending the water out to our homes and businesses and then treating it after it comes back. So much of our infrastructure is approaching the end of its lifespan and needs to be replaced. Now, we should recognize that America is behind much of the world in terms of investing in infrastructure. And that is not only not good for our future economy, it's certainly not good for creating jobs. China is investing 10% of its gross domestic product in infrastructure. Europe is investing 5%. But here in America, which had a phenomenal infrastructure built after World War II, we're investing only 2%. That is barely enough to repair the aging infrastructure that previous generations so thoughtfully funded, let alone prepare the infrastructure to meet the expanding needs of the nation. And infrastructure really can be thought of as kind of the bread and butter of a success of our nation. Building and maintaining infrastructure is one of the most effective ways also to create jobs in the short term. And having infrastructure in place is absolutely critical to strong private sector economic growth over the long term. So it's time to take water infrastructure seriously as a public policy challenge. For too long, we've been putting water infrastructure on the back burner. We're not investing enough in water infrastructure to keep clean, affordable water accessible to all Americans. In fact, we are not even coming close. There is a gap, a significant gap, a growing gap in the area of water infrastructure needs versus actual funding. If we do nothing and stay on the same course, that gap will be $90 billion per year by 2040. That is a disaster for our communities. That gap would leave municipalities with a terrible decision. Allow the infrastructure to continue to degrade, which is obviously not a good idea, or have to raise utility rates astronomically to pay for long neglected improvements. Already, we're seeing this kind of lose-lose proposition play out in my state, in Oregon. Some communities are having to set aside their plans because they can't afford them, to expand their infrastructure, to improve their infrastructure, to replace their infrastructure that is aging. And other communities are proceeding to upgrade their infrastructure, but at costs that are doubling or even quadrupling the cost of water to the citizens. So we need a new way to finance critical water projects. That is why the Water Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or WIFIA, that is contained in this bill fills a key missing link in our system. Currently, federal funding for water infrastructure and sewage through the EPA Clean Water and Safe Drinking Water state revolving funds is helpful, but many projects do not qualify, and we need to expand the amount of funding available. Into that gap comes WIFIA, modeled after the very successful Transportation Infrastructure Finance and Innovation Act, or TIFIA. So we have a proven finance model for infrastructure and transportation. Let's take that proven model and apply it to the challenge of our communities on water. I hold a meeting with our local officials, our city officials, and our county officials before each of my town halls, and I hold a town hall in every county every year. And I can tell you that hardly a meeting with local officials goes by that there aren't 2 or 3 or 4 critical water project needs discussed. That is the motivation for having this WIFIA program before us today. And I want to note that I applaud my colleague from Oklahoma, Senator Inhofe, who has come forward and said, let's not only make this work, but let's lower the threshold, the minimum threshold for projects, so that we make sure that we can get smaller communities, more rural communities involved. That was previously addressed in the bill by saying smaller communities could aggregate their projects and submit their application. But this was a very helpful addition to the conversation. And I really appreciate that type of bipartisan problem solving that is evidenced in this bill as it is and as in the amendment that was proposed by my colleague from Oklahoma and passed yesterday. Now, the reason that funding in this pilot project, and we're talking $50 million a year for 5 years, is effective is it has a huge leverage. It can fund because it's guaranteeing loans that rarely go bad. The historical default on water and sewer bonds is less than 1%. In fact, it's less than 0.1%. So that $50 million to cover defaults can be extraordinarily leveraged. The community gets the funds they need to complete their project at the lowest interest rates possible. And the American public can sleep soundly at night knowing that the Treasury funds are being invested in a manner that is prudent and productive. This source of financing will allow communities to take on 3 types of projects necessary for safe and reliable water systems: repairing the aging infrastructure, upgrading the old systems to modern standards, and expanding the projects to meet growth needs. Another advantage of this structure of financing is that under WIFIA, projects would be selected by a competitive process rather than by state allocations, so that we get funds to the greatest need across this nation. Now, we have communities all across Oregon, every corner of our state, that are facing these infrastructure challenges. I know the same is true. I know from my colleagues talking about it how true this is across our nation. And communities that are in good shape now, in 5 or 10 years, they may see that challenge of meeting new standards or meeting the growth of their community. I want to talk about another key aspect of our recovery, and that's manufacturing. If we don't make things in America, we will not have a middle class in America. Now, our manufacturing sector lost 5 million jobs over the last 14 to 15 years. It's starting to make a comeback, but we should do more to help create good manufacturing jobs. One very simple thing we can do is support Buy America provisions in legislation such as this. We recognize the principle that if we are using taxpayer dollars to complete a public infrastructure project in America, it only makes sense for American businesses and workers to do as much of the work as possible. And for that reason, I will be filing an amendment to this bill to expand the Buy America provisions for our water infrastructure. These two are very much connected together. Yes, we need to be building infrastructure, but we need to make sure those tax dollars build our American economy when the work is being done. So, in closing, let's pass this bill, which has a tremendous amount of good in it. And one of those very good points is this Water Infrastructure Act, WIFIA, that support good jobs and good infrastructure across America. And I want to mention, Mr. President, the great work that my science associate, Mervet Abdelhak, has done on this bill. We are fortunate as senators to often have folks who come and work with us for a year, bringing their tremendous expertise and trying to develop a really important piece of legislation. She has been very involved in this, and I thank her and I thank the program for making those kind of expertise available to our offices. Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I note the absence of quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Mr. President,
Senator from Louisiana.
can I ask unanimous consent to get 802 pending before the Senate, please?
We are in a quorum call.
I suggest the absence of a quorum.
We are in a quorum call.
Vitiate the quorum call.
Without objection.
Okay, I'd ask unanimous consent to call up as pending 802. Is there objection?
Is there objection?
Well, there is no one here. I'd like to call the amendment up. If there is objection, I can talk about the amendment now and then, okay? I will talk about the amendment now and then attempt to call the amendment up later in the day, and I thank the chair. Mr. President, the amendment that I have pending or trying to get pending for the WRDA bill would delay the increase in flood insurance rates for people in this country that are going to be suffering in unbelievable ways, not just homeowners, not just business owners, but communities, Mr. President, across America. This isn't a Louisiana issue. It's not a Louisiana-Texas issue. It is a national issue, as this chart will show. These are all the states in the United States that have flood insurance policies, starting with Florida, who has the most, millions, to over 2 million flood insurance policies in the state of Florida. Texas is second with 645,000. Louisiana has 486,000 policies. California, the fourth state, has 256,000. New Jersey has 240,000. South Carolina has 205. New York, 178. North Carolina, 138,000. Virginia, over 100,000. Georgia, close to 100,000. And Mississippi at 75,000. Mr. President, this is a very serious issue, and I thank the chair, Senator Boxer, who's worked so hard on this bill, the underlying bill of WRDA, which is so important. And I thank those members that came last night. I understand Senator Menendez gave a very fiery and passionate speech about the problem that he's facing in New Jersey. I want to thank Senator Schumer, Senator Gillibrand, and Senator Lautenberg for co-sponsoring this important amendment. We want to work with the chairman and the ranking member to pass a WRDA bill. There's no state that benefits more from the WRDA bill than Louisiana, and I am extremely grateful for her leadership, not just on this bill, but on the Restore Act, which she helped shepherd through, which has helped the Gulf Coast in measurable ways. Her support of the FAIR Act on revenue sharing, that's going to help the Gulf Coast get the revenues we need, just like interior states have, to be able to build our own levees and not have to be such a drain on the federal treasury. We can and are willing to do our own work. But, Mr. President, the flood insurance bill known as Biggers Waters, I just want to call to the Senator's attention, never passed the Senate. The bill was never brought to the Senate floor. The flood insurance bill that's called Biggers Waters came out of the Banking Committee with a bipartisan vote, a similar bill. That was a House bill, but a similar bill came out of the Senate. But it never came to the Senate floor for a vote. None of us ever got to debate it on the floor. If you weren't on the Banking Committee, wake up, because this bill is going to affect your state. And if you're not on the Banking Committee, please listen to what I'm about to say. The bill never came to the Senate floor, although some of us protested about it at the time. There are statements in the record that show the protests that any number of us made at the time. The bill was then sort of went dark. The next time it appeared, it was tucked in to the transportation bill, which had the Restore Act in it, and the Biggers Water flood insurance, which might have passed the House of Representatives. I'm not sure. Maybe it just came out of the House committee, and I'm trying to get clarification if this bill ever was passed by either body. And I want clarification on that in just a few minutes, please. But it most certainly never came to the Senate floor. So no one here, except members of the Banking Committee, which Senator Vitter is a member, and he knows this issue very well, voted on this. And so it's become somewhat of a, not a surprise to me, but a surprise to others to find out that flood insurance rates, based on the reform bill that was tucked into the transportation bill and to the Restore Act bill, is now going to raise rates by 25, 50%, 100% on homeowners. And when the grandfather clause, which was put in the bill to grandfather many property owners, expires, my constituents tell me that their properties will become worthless. Now, you can understand how a property that's even worth $1 million or $500,000 or $250,000 that has a flood insurance premium attached to it of a reasonable amount of money, $500, $600, $700, which is still a lot of money, but people that live along the coast understand that we've got to pay a little bit higher flood insurance rates and we have to build smarter and better, which we're doing as fast as we possibly can with the monies that we have. There's not a coastal community in America that's not fully awake after Katrina, Rita, Gustav, Ike, and Sandy. Trust me. From the East Coast to North Carolina to the entire Gulf Coast region, we are awake. We are understanding what's happening, and we are trying as hard as we can to make our communities as resilient as possible. We are not, as you know, completely to blame for the increased frequency of the storms or the rising sea levels. We all have a share of that, and it's happening, and we are on the front line. Our communities have been devastated. Our people are literally drowning. We lost 1,800 people in Katrina, 2,400 between Louisiana and Mississippi, drowning and literally dying through these storms. We lost several hundred people in Sandy. So we understand what's happening, and we're doing everything we can. This flood insurance bill that never passed this Senate, and I'm not sure it passed the House, but it did come out of both committees, different versions of it, and now it's known as Biggert-Waters. It's known as Biggert-Waters. I understand Congressman Waters is no longer a member of Congress. Biggert is gone, Waters is here. Biggert is gone, Waters is here. So the bill was pushed as a way, and I understand the importance of getting the flood insurance program on a financially sound footing. We most certainly don't expect all the people of America to subsidize coastal communities, some of which may be second homes, et cetera. But in my communities, we're not talking about second homes. We're not talking about vacation properties in large measure. We're talking about primary homes of fishermen, of dock workers, of people that work on the river, of boat captains, of, you know, these industries, the oil and gas industry, the roughnecks, the engineers, that have to work by the nature of their work near the coast, which is where the trade and commerce of this nation comes from. If we could operate our trade and commerce only on railroads and highways, maybe we could all go live in Oklahoma or in Nevada. But, Mr. President, you're from Hawaii. You understand that we have coastal communities all the way from Oregon to California to Texas to Louisiana to Mississippi. And yes, there are some lovely vacation spots along the coast. But there are also communities that I represent, like in Terrebonne Parish and in Lafourche Parish and in Jefferson Parish, where people wake up before the sun and they don't come home until it's dark. And they're working at coastal businesses that are very important to the entire economic strength of this nation. But this bill, Biggert-Waters, puts the entire burden of supporting coastal communities on the people that live on the coast. While some people that have a lot of money and can afford a mountaintop view go on the top of the mountains in other states, and, you know, I'm not picking on Colorado and Utah, but those come to mind, multi-million-dollar homes sitting on beautiful views that look out across, you know, lots of land, and maybe they're not mindful of the work that's done on our coast. So this is an issue that is important for the whole nation. And so to have this bill pass, and I knew it when it happened, and Mark Pryor, I understand, put something in the record at the time, but now we're on the Water Resources Bill, a very important bill for coastal communities, and it's an opportunity for us to fix this bill or to get a reprieve for a short period of time until we can find a better approach other than rendering thousands of properties along the coast, whether it's in Texas or California or Florida or New York or New Jersey, who were just, battered badly by Sandy, to put additional stress on these communities. And so while I don't have the specific answer as to how to fix it in the long term, my amendment would simply hold off these rate increases for a year. It doesn't repeal the bill. It will just hold off these rate increases for a year, giving these members here in Congress a time and an opportunity to fix what is terribly broken and to try to find a better, more affordable way to do so. There are 480,000 policyholders in Louisiana who are already complaining about the flood insurance rates as they are today. Some people are, and when I go home now, and I go home often, very frequently, this is all people are talking about. There are other important issues that are going on, but I don't blame them, and I most certainly understand it as a homeowner in Louisiana, and our delegation understands this, that people are saying we're getting notices from our insurance that our insurance is going to go up hundreds, if not thousands of dollars, and what happens when the grandfather clause, which is about to happen in October of 2014. So this flood insurance issue is a very important issue for the people in Louisiana, as I said, in Texas, and in Mississippi, in Florida, and that's what my amendment will do. My amendment is not pending, but I've filed an amendment. We're waiting for a CBO score. We most certainly want to offset this if we can find the revenues that it will take to offset this temporary reprieve. And I ask really the leadership of both Republican and Democratic leaders to work with me and work with the other senators that are interested in finding a solution to send a signal to these coastal areas that Congress understands the pressures of flood insurance in our low-lying areas, that would be in Maryland or Virginia or New York or New Jersey, that we hear them, we understand what is about to happen, and we would like a chance to try to adjust, to fix, et cetera, et cetera. So I'm going to leave an additional statement for the floor. I'm going to be working with the leadership. I know there are other members that have amendments that are important to the WRDA bill. It is not my intention to stop this WRDA bill. It's a bill that I most certainly support. Louisiana can be greatly benefited. I want to thank Senator Vitter for his strong work as the ranking member of the EPW committee on WRDA, and we have some very important authorizations. But let me also say something about this WRDA bill in relation to actual dollars. I happen to sit on the Appropriations Committee for Energy and Water, Mr. President. And I appreciate serving on that committee, and our job is to actually find money and direct funding to build some of these water resource projects. Just yesterday, Senator Feinstein held a hearing, and she chairs our committee. Senator Lamar Alexander is our ranking member, on the budget for the Corps of Engineers. And I see my good friend Ben Cardin here and others that are very interested in projects in the WRDA bill, but they will be shocked to know that when I asked Joellen Darcy, the leader of the Corps of Engineers, civilian leader of the Corps, what was the number of backlogged projects, new construction projects that were backlogged, and how much money was in the bill to build them this year. The first number was $1.6 billion. That's how much is in the appropriations bill, roughly, to build new water projects in the country. $1.6 billion. It sounds like a lot of money until you hear the second answer. Then I asked her, how many projects are in the queue for funding, ready to go, meritorious projects, urgently needed new construction, and she said $60 billion. Okay, we have $1.6 billion in the budget to spend, and we have $60 billion worth of projects. We follow these numbers pretty closely because many of those projects are in Louisiana. And so while it's important to get the WORDA bill passed, which is authorizing not only new projects, but it is also putting in some very important core reforms to expedite the way some of these projects are built, the real problem and the real dilemma is closing the gap between what we've authorized and what we can actually afford to build. Again, only 1.6 in the core budget for new construction, and pending, even without this WORDA bill, $60 billion in backlogged, authorized, important programs in all of our districts. And with this WORDA bill, there are additional $23 billion in authorizations. So yes, I support new authorizations. Yes, I support the WORDA bill. Yes, I most certainly support the reforms to the Corps of Engineers that are embedded in the language of this WORDA bill. But I cannot allow this to move forward, at least without raising a red flag and asking for some reprieve on the flood insurance issue. Now, I want to be flexible. I want to be open. I want to be a team player. This is not my way or the highway kind of time. I've tried as much as I can to avoid that kind of politics here because it's very difficult for all of us to move forward together, and I have so much respect for Senator Boxer and a good bit of respect for Senator Vitter, who's the ranking member. But, Mr. President, this is the only way I know right now to raise this issue and to say that we cannot, in Louisiana, with 480,000 flood insurance policies, manage to build our communities, to recover, which we're doing beautifully. I mean, we'd like to go faster, but you haven't heard a lot of complaints coming from us. Our people are working hard, rolling up our sleeves. Our communities are coming back. We're using the insurance money. We're using the Community Development Block Grant money to build as smartly and as quickly as we can. We've created a water institute. Every single one of our parishes has gone through what we call charrettes and community meetings to see how we can elevate our homes and build them more resiliently. But this is just a huge and very tough burden to lay on the shoulders of our coastal communities, not just in Louisiana, in Terrebonne and Lafourche and Cameron and Calcasieu and St. Mary Parish and the river parishes, St. John, St. James, St. Charles, and Jefferson Parish. It's hurting North Louisiana as well. We have flood insurance policies all the way up in our state, and we would have flood insurance. Why would we have flooding? Because we have the Mississippi River. And we're happy to have the Mississippi River, but the Mississippi River doesn't belong only to us. May I remind everyone that the Mississippi River, the Missouri River, the Ohio River is the spine, the backbone of our commerce for the whole nation. So why should the people of Louisiana that drain the entire continent, the river runs right here through the mouth of the rivers, through New Orleans, why is it that the people that live in South Louisiana have to pick up 100% of that risk? And that's the way this bill is structured, to put the burden 100% instead of spreading it to everyone, to the whole country, in a reasonable and responsible way, is to say that you have to be self-sustaining in your flood insurance policies. So we're sorry the Mississippi River, which provides commerce and wealth and creates huge amounts of wealth and jobs for all of us, but the people that live at the mouth have to take the water and pay for it yourselves. That is not going to work for us. It's not working for us. And so that's why I am standing on this floor. I want to work this out. I am open to a number of suggestions. I hope that the senators that have lots of flood insurance issues, like senators in Missouri and senators in Illinois and senators in other states, will, give us some suggestions about how to move forward. Again, if this bill had passed the Senate, and it was the will of the Senate, and I would have been on the losing side of that, I would not be standing here today. This bill never came before the Senate. Never came before the Senate. It was tucked into a bill that we had no chance to amend. None. You cannot amend a bill coming out of conference. There was no chance to amend this. No chance to fix this, which is why I hope that my colleagues will understand and be patient with me that this is not about losing an issue last year and coming back and crying about it. This is about we never got a chance to even talk about this on the Senate floor, and now this is a water bill. It has everything to do with the subject matter. It is not germane to the subject matter of this bill, and I would like to have a vote on my amendment or a vote in some way to declare that we are acknowledging this problem, that we might not have a solution today, but we most certainly are willing to work on it because this is devastating for coastal communities all over the country. And it is not fair for our working coast, whether it's fisheries or oil and gas or wind or manufacturing, for our coastal communities or commerce and trade to pick up the entire burden of this flood insurance program. So let's try to be reasonable. I'm going to be as patient as I can be. I understand how important this bill is to everyone. I am most mindful of how important it is to my state. We've been trying to get a word of bill out here now on the floor for several years, and we finally have one. But I'm going to leave my amendment as it is. It's not pending. It's been filed. I'm going to ask for this vote to be worked out, and until then we'll object to any other amendments coming up for a vote until we get some way forward. And again, I want to be flexible, I want to be open, and I would like to eventually see the word of bill pass. Thank you, Mr. President.
Mr. President.
Senator from Maryland.
Mr. President, I ask unanimous consent to speak as if in morning business.
Without objection.
And I, of course, will not object. I just want to make it clear that at noon, the two leaders are coming to do a back and forth. So up until the time they arrive, I think I just wanted to let my friend know. And then after the leaders, Senator Vitter should be recognized to speak about the issue Senator Landrieu just raised, to be followed by me, if that's okay, if I could do that.